YA fantasy is a really big deal, right? It's time I sell out, isn't it? Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just any book. Today we'll be talking about The Sapling Cage by Margaret Killjoy, which came out on Tuesday, and it's really, really cool. And I'm going to do the usual thing. I'll tell you quickly what it's about, like as a synopsis, and then you go and read the book. Right now, get it from Feminist Press or wherever you can find audiobooks, or regret that you didn't back the Kickstarter. One of those three options. And I'll give you the quick synopsis, and then I'll drink some more beer, which is appropriate for YA books, right? You read the book, and then you come back and we talk about why this book is so brilliant in detail. And if you don't mind spoilers, then you can just stay and not read the book. But, still, read the book, get the book, talk about the book. It needs to have a larger audience. Anyway, let's get started. All right. The Sapling Cage is a fantasy book. It's a relatively short fantasy book. The audiobook has 9 hours, which I assume is somewhere around 300 pages, roughly. It is a first-person narrative by one Laurel, who becomes a witch, who wants to become a witch, and that's roughly the main plot. It's in a wonderful, unique fantasy world that feels interestingly tabletop role-playing game-ish in a lot of ways, and I'll talk about why that I think is a clever idea later on. Laurel's main point is, Laurel was born as a boy, and only girls can be witches. So there is a certain question here of how Laurel can become a witch. Also, witches are not, beloved everywhere, so being a witch is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. So there will be conflict down that road as well. And there is a new dark danger facing the lands in all kinds of ways, and witches are being blamed for, trees dying and shit like that. And that's also not good. So maybe Laurel picked the wrong time to become a witch. That's roughly the plot. This is part one of, I guess, a trilogy called Daughters of the Empty Throne. And I really enjoyed it. I think it's a book that is both wonderful as what you might call YA. Not that I know anything about YA. When I was 15, I read Conan the Barbarian stories, which are decidedly not young adult. Although they may have even less sex scenes than this book. I'm just saying. So by having a 16-year-old main character or narrator and having a lot of other younger characters, it is definitely appropriate, I think, for younger readers. And I think that's important. But I also believe it's a very good and important book for people that are older, because it does some interesting things to the fantasy genre in general that, people that grew up reading Conan the Barbarian, or people that grew up reading A Game of Thrones, or people that grew up reading The Wheel of Time, or all kinds of other fantasy, can actually learn from, reflect on why maybe there is a need for newer and better and cooler fantasy out there. And that, I think, is the main thing. This is a very positive, a very optimistic, a very powerful and empowering fantasy story. And we need more of those. It's not all doom and gloom. And especially if we're, struggling with all kinds of stuff in our lives, having a fantasy book with a character that we can sort of empathize with, going through shit and still, having hope is a very powerful thing. So get this book, read it, give it to your kids. Tell them that, it's cool to be whoever you want to be, and you will maybe, hopefully, sometimes overcome evil. If that sounds like a message you want to have in your fantasy book, I don't know, go check this one out. Also, really cool action in there. Also, really dark magic in there. So, more reasons to get the book. That's all I have to say about why you should get the book. It's really good. I had a lot of fun. It does certainly, have its issues if you want to be picky about stuff. But I think as a whole, it's a very good fantasy story for a lot of people, and it does touch on a lot of important things. And books are important, not only for entertainment, but also for, making us better humans. And if a book achieves that, that's a win in my book. Anyway, I'll have some beer, you read the book, or at least order it, and then we'll talk about some stuff in detail. All right. I assume you have read the book, or you don't care about spoilers. Let's talk about what makes The Sapling Cage such a good book in a lot of important ways. Part one, fantasy matters. Now, I've said that for a long time. It's every time I talk about a fantasy book having issues, and everyone, no, it's just entertainment, keep politics out of it. That doesn't work, because fantasy, or any form of literature, does always have, politics in it. If it's only the politics of the author, but usually the world that it represents is related to our world in a lot of ways, and what it depicts and what it doesn't depict can inform how we see the world later on. Now that's the first part here. So fantasy matters, and I believe that firmly. The next part is that fantasy matters even more if you are maybe growing up or starting out your reading journey at whatever age, because that's when you're most impressionable. Your first music album that you ever bought will have a huge impact and will probably stay with you for the rest of your life. The first book you ever read will stay with you for the rest of your life, and so on and so on and so on. The first things matter, and the younger, the earlier in your life you read a book, the more formative it is, which means that books that are somewhat targeted at a younger audience because they have, younger protagonists, are maybe not as full of explicit violence, sexuality, and other dark things as other books. Those kind of books have an even bigger responsibility towards the audience, or there we need to look even closer on what kind of world these books are presenting. This is something I do also firmly believe. I am not an expert in a lot of YA fiction because, I'm old and grumpy now. I don't read that much YA. But I did read a lot of Drizzt Do'Urden novels, or reread them last year at what I call Drizztmas. I should probably make a playlist for those. And I found them lacking. I think this here is a much needed update to the idea of fantasy that is fast-paced, full of action, really cool, and, approachable to a younger audience because it does actually have some, good messages versus all the misogyny and, racism and all the other terrible stuff in those Drizzt books. So, let's talk about all of that, and let's start with the first part, which is, once again, the role-playing game aspect. I'm deliberately comparing it, or not really comparing it, but putting it into contrast with those Dark Elf novels, those Dungeons and Dragons tie-in novels of the old 80s, because there is certainly a role-playing game-ish quality to some of the world building, some of the stuff happening in the Sapling Cage. You have basically 3 big classes. You have knights, you have witches, and you have brigands. You also have sailors, so I guess it's 4, but we don't see many sailors in the first book. I assume this will probably come later on. So this is very much a world that feels like you can totally play your own role-playing games in this world, and I probably would enjoy that. Also, I love brigands as a class. It's better than the rogue because it kind of sounds cooler, but it is what it is. Now, why does that matter? I think we kind of know, hopefully accept, that tabletop role-playing games as a whole have had a large boost over the last, decade-ish, I guess, at least with, the Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and the beginning of, a lot of, live streams and video content with stuff like, Critical Role and so forth, becoming huge bits. A lot of young people have come back to playing role-playing games, whereas in the 90s and early 2000s, it was mostly, a few younger people finding the hobby and a lot of old farts complaining how nothing is like it used to be in the 80s. This has definitely not changed. There's still old people complaining how nothing is good anymore and everything has gone woke, and fuck those people. But we need to accept that tabletop role-playing games as a form of entertainment, as a form of exploration, self-exploration, finding out who you are, who you want to be, and so forth, have become a big deal in recent years. And that's a good thing. Because, once again, especially for younger players, younger people, role-playing games can be a valuable tool of self-exploration, finding out, stuff about yourself, about your gender, what you want to try out, because they give a safe framework in the same way that fiction gives a safe framework. Just that role-playing games have a more interactive aspect to it. I think that's important. That's really good. I appreciate that. I'm not going to do any commentary on current political aspects of, say, Dungeons & Dragons itself. I'm just talking about the art form or genre or whatever you want to call it of role-playing games in general. So having this world resemble that, I think, makes it even more accessible to younger readers that have maybe already played some form of a tabletop role-playing game or have watched some Critical Role or any other, whatever content creator they enjoy play on stream some form of role-playing game. It is accessible in that regard. They could potentially even just take this world and make up their own stories in it and play it if they want to explore it further. I can certainly see myself playing an adventure in the world of the Sapling Cage. I would probably enjoy that a lot. So that, I think, is important. And that, once again, is why I kind of tied it to, say, the older Dungeons & Dragons tie-in novels, in particular, the incredibly successful stuff that R.A. Salvatore wrote in the 90s. Because, once again, that's stuff that people that are already sort of doing some form of self-exploration can connect to and read. Now, as I said before, those Drizzt books are bad. They're really bad, not only, when it comes to like prose and stuff, but especially when it comes to how they portray fantasy worlds, how they portray characters, how they portray well, a lot of misogyny, racism, and all kinds of other really bad things. I'm not going back there. The problem is, of course, that a lot of fantasy, being conservative, being how often inspired by people like Tolkien, who are incredibly conservative and so forth, has some very basic staples that are not necessarily the fault of, someone like Salvatore, because he has to live with, the forms of the Forgotten Realms that, wizards and before them TSR kind of presented him with. So the blame is not all on like one specific author. I'm just saying fantasy as a genre has often been very conservative in the kind of worlds it presents. And that is a problem. It can be enjoyable, don't get me wrong. I've definitely read some books that have kings and knights and shit that I really enjoyed, but there should be alternatives. And that, I think, is the next important part here that we're going to move forward to. World building matters. And the world of the Sapling Cage definitely challenges that in a really cool way. See, there's no king. This is called Daughters of the Empty Throne in an important way. The king has been, I assume, kicked out. There's talk about a rebellion in the past and so forth. A lot of stuff is self-organized. Villages have communal fields and so forth. There are still dukes and barons and duchesses, or at least one duchess. I'm not quite sure how that fully works because, well, this is the first book and I assume we'll get more on like where people, get their still hereditary power as a baron or other form of nobility from. Although we definitely see that on the smaller village level, the lords of smaller or lords and ladies and the local nobility definitely lost power and just became people that still got sort of like respect for maybe being the founders of a village or whatever, or town, but not necessarily have any power, which is exactly the thing with Laurel's friend Lane, who lives in this fallen down, tumbled down mansion because, that shit's over. Hereditary nobility is mostly gone. So we have a much more self-organized syndicalist, I guess, anarcho-syndicalist sort of communal world. And that is the first big thing because for whatever reason, and partly that's Tolkien and partly that's other fantasy authors going for medieval Europe, everyone kind of assumes some form of feudalism without questioning how feudalism works. Not that, there wasn't, a lot of like communal power in at least, Central European feudalism with, villages and village councils having a lot of power even when it comes to standing up to lords and so forth. We have sort of this idea, you have kings, you have knights, and they kind of rule the land, everyone else has to scrape for every piece of bread, and then there's brigands out there who can either be evil or can be sort of noble Robin Hood types. Questioning that on a fundamental level by having people mostly dealing with their own shit and being self-reliant, I think is the first important part here. This is a wonderful alternative, and fantasy should do that. Like China Miéville once said that the power of fantasy is incredibly radical, and that the thing that Tolkien gave us was, to imagine any possible world. So that's a radical power. Most people don't use that because the worlds we end up getting by most people, not all of us, are still very, conservative in a lot of ways. This is not. This is radical in that sense. And that's good. That's positive because it allows you to think outside of these elements that are obviously still very much in our own world. So the first important part here, this is a, dare I say, somewhat anarchist-influenced fantasy world, which of course makes a lot of sense when you know who Margaret Killjoy is. I love that. It's really cool. It kind of gets also explored in more detail when we have these different societies, the different groups. We have the witches, the Order of the Vine, which is, if you've ever been like part of any sort of like communal discussion in any like left-wing culture center, whatever group, you kind of recognize elements of that. I've certainly seen it be much more toxic on a personal level than the Council of the Witches, but yeah, you kind of get it. And I like that because it, once again, it showcases different ways of organizing society, and fantasy should always do that. So the world building in that regard is already really cool. The next part is, of course, and we're going to talk about this, gender and exploration of that. Now, I am not qualified to talk too much about transgender issues in any way, shape or form, because I'm very much a cis dude in a lot of ways. So I don't know too much about this. I, however, think that the way this book does, in fact, deal with both gender and gender exploration and self-image and these aspects, and as well with sexuality, I think, is really important, and it's really clever, and we come back to that later. So yeah, Laurel is born a boy, but is a girl. And that's the key sort of conflict in a lot of ways that our first-person narrator, Laurel, has to face up with. And as someone who has no experience in that whatsoever, I found myself learning a lot reading this book, because that kind of gave me insights into how to how people may deal with that, especially when it comes to questions of like, how do I then conform? How much do I have to conform? Should I use magic to alter my body? Should I not do that? Should people accept me the way I am or not? Now, that is an ongoing sort of conflict that, I assume people will always deal with. I mean, even cis people like me very much deal with the question of like how we present. We just kind of get the option of just ignoring it for a long time, but it is always there. And for people that are trans in some way, shape or form, that is obviously a much more key thing. Also, how it does involve, questions of sexuality. When Laurel meets people that are clearly romantically interested in them, but only as long as they think Laurel is a boy, or only as long as they think that Laurel is a girl, and how realizing that Laurel is trans sort of leads to conflicts that I would probably never had to sort of navigate in a lot of ways. And that, I think, is really well done, because there is no fixed sort of this is how it is. Laurel wrestles with this constantly and tries to figure it out, and there's still no final decision on like where this will end. And I think that is really interesting, because once again, this can help a lot of people sort of figure this shit out for ourselves as readers, which is why this is important, once again, especially for younger readers, in the same way that role-playing games can explore that. I know a lot of, dudes who have played women in some form as characters at tabletop games, and the other way around. I know women that only play men at role-playing games, and they can explore parts of, all those different gender roles that we kind of have in a playful way. And having someone to identify with, having that inside perspective on how things change or don't change, the fears of being found out, the fears of not being found out, and so forth, that's a really, really interesting approach. And I really appreciate that that's part of the focus of this book. But it is important that this is sort of intersected with the world building. And it goes one step further, and that's the next part that I need to talk about, and I think is really good. This is very much a book that is radically accepting of individual humanity and of how people see themselves and who people want to be. That is really good. It is, however, not looking away. Because there is still discrimination in this world. This is not just, what you might call queer normative, where just like all kinds of genders and sexual orientations are living happily together. No, this is a world that is maybe slightly more accepting in some regards when it comes to queer relationships. There's clearly, both lesbian and gay in any shape or form relationships here, but when it comes to transgender, it is still very much sort of a world that has not fully made up its mind. And that certainly, parallels a lot of experiences that we have today, depending on where you live, especially if you live in, parts of, the European Union like me, or probably some urban parts of the United States and other parts of the global north. You can be queer in a lot of ways and be accepted. That is already there. But there are other parts where you still face all kinds of discrimination, hatred, and so forth. And having a fantasy world that does sort of walk this sort of line between being everything queer is cool and the world where everyone who is not just a white cis hetero guy or girl will be killed immediately by the evil Inquisition, and even girls and women have to be subjugated constantly, because that's clearly how the Middle Ages were, right? Spoiler, they were not. Is I think admirable in that it does reflect our world in a way that a lot of fantasy, for whatever reasons, does not. Some of them being incredibly negative, some of them being admirable on their own, because yes, we need also fantasy that is very much queer normative and just normalizes all kinds of gender and sexual identities, and I appreciate that. But having something that is, more reflective of what is going on right now, I think is important. Once again, for a younger audience that is coming to terms with all kinds of stuff, having a book they can relate to in that regard, I think, is really helpful. And having it set in a fantasy world does sort of allow readers that bit of difference, that what if, that is much easier to ask when you're clearly, talking about being witches or knights or whatever, versus when you have to figure this shit out in your own world, because sometimes we need that distance to kind of come to terms with who we are. So that's the next part that I wanted to talk about. Now, where to go next? Witchcraft. Clearly, this is also about witches. That's the main point. Laurel wants to become a witch. There's the Order of the Vine. We get some bits and pieces about witchcraft. We get some pieces of magic. Clearly, the whole sapling tree storing magic in cages, I think, is a sapling cage. Storing magic in cages, in trees and skulls, is a really cool thing. I love that. Don't get me wrong. I really love that. My point is, however, there is something more here, and witchcraft has certainly been around, at least in its current form, as, some form of neo-paganism since 70, 80-ish years, ever since, Gerald Gardner made it really public once even the UK kind of rescinded their witchcraft laws. And it has always intersected with questions of feminism, especially when you go to, say, California, for example, where you have a lot of Wicca intersection of different forms of Wicca and other modern witchcraft intersecting with second-wave feminism and so forth. And these elements show up here because you have Wiccan covens and so forth that, from what I know, and I'm obviously not an expert, I've just read some, Ronald Hutton and stuff, that are more anarchist or syndicalist or at least equal when it comes to how they organize in some regards. And you have, obviously, on the other hand, elements that are, by being more political in a lot of ways, tied into some of the negative aspects of, say, second wave and radical feminism. And we have this in one story here when Laurel finds out that there have been other people that joined witches and that were born men and were, women. And that some of them were then, were not accepted by witches, who are clearly, by definition, the one order left to just exclusively women and women's power. And this is not a full litigation of all things TERF right now, and it can't be, and it shouldn't be. But once again, it shows that in a fantasy story that is very accepting of being, trans in a lot of ways, it also shows the continuous sort of struggle that is tied into that very specific identity. And I don't think, from what I can tell, will never... That kind of internal struggle and external struggle will always be there. That's kind of the problem of being marginalized in any way or form. You can find places where you're mostly accepted, but it will never fully go away. That's just the way it is. And we see this in here, having these ideas of witchcraft being clearly influenced in some way by contemporary modern day neo-paganism, I think, was interesting because it does reflect both the good and the potential bad that these forms of neo-paganism bring with them. And that's, once again, a level of depth that is, I think, impressive in a book this short. So, where does all of that lead us? Because, obviously, we need to come to an end here. I really enjoyed the book. I think there's a couple of key points why this book is important, why this book matters, why this book is great. It's on the world building, presenting an alternative world that is really cool. It is in the exploration of who we are, of who one wants to be, through a radical first-person narrative that may leave some bits and pieces out here and there, because obviously if you are a first-person character, you don't notice everything. Seeing that, I think, is really good. Having the sort of personal struggles between the different whelps, the different girls wanting to, also trying to come to terms with their different forms of personal identity, and how Laurel interacts with them, I think, was really helpful. Something that I obviously, where I grew up and how I grew up, don't know much about, but it felt real to me, and that's a good thing, right? So having that aspect in here, I think, is important. The idea of, magic being sort of turned from something that is out there into something that can be monopolized is a great metaphor. It's something that, I guess, me having read too much about, way too much how capitalism works and how you have land enclosure and all of that stuff and how that kind of is used to go places, I think may read some a bit too much into, but it's certainly something that is out there, and understanding that these threads to our resources will always be there, I think, is important. Which leads me to the end of this. This is a great book. It does have a conflict. The conflict gets resolved. The throne stays empty. There will be some threat for the future, however, and I think this is important. This book offers hope. It is positive in that regard. But it also shows that just while you may have won for now, there will always be people who will try to actually stop the future from being good. And we need to be, aware of that. We need to be looking out for that. We need to be woke in that regard. And this book shows that as well. So, I don't know. I really enjoyed it. What can I say? Also, really cool action. It does show that we can write fantasy that feels a lot like Dungeons & Dragons fantasy, like role-playing game fantasy. And we can do this in a proper, in a much better way than it has been done a long time. We can do this to be empowering. We can do this to reflect, what the 21st century is like. And we hopefully can make a better world by, reading these kind of books, by playing these kind of games, and by trying to be just better people. That's great. So I don't know. Go get the book. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you read the book. I hope you enjoyed the book. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Like, subscribe, join the Patreon if you feel like it. Do all these wonderful things, but mostly read the book and be nice people. That's important. And until then, thanks and cheers.